A political prisoner was imprisoned because he opposed the racism practiced by his government against the people, so he decided that he would do the impossible to escape. But he was imprisoned on the second floor, making it impossible to dig a tunnel or escape through the window. There was no way out except through the door. The problem, though, was that his cell had two doors, an inner door and an outer door. The outer door couldn't be opened from the inside, and the keyhole was on the outside. On top of these two doors, there were 8 more doors he had to get through to escape from the prison, making a total of 10 doors. In this situation, one might think that escaping was impossible, but this prisoner used his mind and crafted some very innovative tools. I won't spoil the details for you. These tools helped him get through all the doors and carry out his escape. So what were these tools, and how did he make them while inside the prison? Stay tuned for the story. Peace be upon you. This is Shams al-Din. Our story took place in the 1970s in South Africa. For those who don't know, South Africa has suffered throughout its history from colonization, especially by the British and the Dutch. It's the African country with the largest population of white people of European descent. And although the whites were and still are the minority in the country, there was a system of apartheid against black people and Africans, who are the original inhabitants of the country. The whites had their own neighborhoods, their own places, which were clean, organized, and beautiful. But black people weren't allowed to enter these areas. They were forced to live in poor, dirty neighborhoods under very harsh conditions. This is apartheid in short, which lasted in South Africa from 1948 until 1994. The South African people, especially the Africans who are the original inhabitants, resisted and fought to end this system. The greatest symbol of resistance was Nelson Mandela, who took up arms and resisted the apartheid system with force, which resulted in him being imprisoned for 27 years. But after that, he became the first African president of South Africa when they finally managed to end the system. For this reason, South Africa is one of the strongest supporters of Palestine, because they have suffered and understand the history of occupation and apartheid, and they know that occupation only ends through resistance. Even though apartheid in South Africa served the interests of the white man, there were honorable white people who rejected this system. This story starts with these two guys, one named Tim Jenkin and the other named Stephen Lee. Both were white South African citizens, and both were activists against the apartheid system. One of the things Tim Jenkin did once was carry a bomb in a bag and put it on one of the streets, and suddenly, boom, it exploded. But actually, it was a special kind of bomb, a bomb filled with papers. These papers had a message for the people, both white and black, urging them to resist the government and the apartheid system. The two were friends and continued their resistance activities for years. But like any oppressive government, the security forces in South Africa at that time were tight, with surveillance, espionage, and intelligence everywhere. Eventually, they were caught. Security forces went to their homes, raided them, and then arrested them. Tim Jenkin and Stephen were imprisoned in January 1978 and were put in Pretoria Prison, which was considered one of the toughest prisons in South Africa, classified as maximum security. The charges against them were terrorism, and they were sentenced to 12 years. But what the prison administration and guards didn't know was that these two were determined to escape even before their sentence was handed down in court. For them, it was impossible to stay in prison for that long. However, the prison was tough, with a lot of security measures in place to prevent any escape attempts. The fence was made of a 6-meter-high iron mesh. Armed guards patrolled the roofs 24/7, and at night, dogs were released in the prison yards, dogs trained to sniff out and chase down any prisoner trying to escape. When Tim and Stephen were first taken to their cells, they noticed the number of doors they passed through. Door after door, like the doors never ended. Some were heavy doors, some were barred doors, and some were just regular wooden doors. But honestly, with how many doors they passed through, it felt like the prison was nothing but doors. From their first days in prison, when they were allowed out for break times and to leave their cells, they would always explore every corner they could, looking at the walls, the exits, and the entrances, trying to find any possible weaknesses. They quickly realized it was going to be really difficult and complicated. Tim and Stephen weren't the only political prisoners in the prison. There were 10 others, making a total of 12, and they were all in the same section, with their cells next to each other. Their section was on the second floor, so the idea of escaping through a tunnel was impossible. How could you dig from the second floor? And the windows were too high, so there was no way out except through the cell door, which had a lock on it. Every day, Tim would stare at the cell lock, thinking about how he could unlock it. He wasn't an expert in locks, but he had some previous experience. He used to mess around with locks, sometimes opening them with wires. Once he understood how locks worked, he started closely examining the cell lock, trying to imagine what it looked like inside and the components within. He even started picturing what the key that could unlock it might look like. Then an idea hit him. He grabbed a piece of paper, placed it over the lock, and traced the dimensions. He wanted to figure out the size of the key he'd need to unlock it. After that, he took another piece of paper, folded it, and inserted it into the lock along with a pen. This time, his goal was to measure the depth of the lock. He conducted these little experiments using paper and pens to get the key's measurements. And remember, this was in 1978, so locks weren't as advanced as they are today. In the end, he managed to sketch out a design for the key with measurements that he believed matched the original key's size. Now that he had the measurements, how was he going to make the key? The idea he had was to craft it from wood, because they worked in the prison's woodworking shop and made all sorts of things out of wood. So Tim decided to try making the key out of wood. Obviously, a wooden key was something unusual and really strange, and when he shared the idea with his friend Stephen, Stephen wasn't convinced. He didn't think a wooden key would actually open the lock, even if the measurements were correct. But at that point, they had nothing to lose, so why not give it a shot? Tim went ahead and made the key while working in the shop, but he had to do it under the watchful eyes of the guards, so it was tricky. His friend Stephen was always trying to cover for him. Finally, after a whole week, he managed to finish making the key. But the next step was figuring out how to get the key out of the shop. Obviously, the prisoners were searched when they left the shop, so how could he smuggle the key out without the guards finding it? The solution was in the coffee cup or coffee holder they had. Each prisoner had a cup, but even these cups were searched. The guard would pour out any leftover coffee into the sink to make sure the prisoners weren't hiding anything inside. But Tim discovered that the bottom of the coffee cup could be unscrewed, and inside there was a small space where he could hide the key. So, he unscrewed the base, stuffed some paper inside to pack the key in tight so it wouldn't move around, and screwed it back on. That way, if the guard shook the cup, he wouldn't hear the key rattling. When the prisoners lined up to leave the workshop, the guard started searching them one by one. As usual, he took their coffee cups, poured out any leftover coffee, and checked inside. When Tim's turn came, he was nervous but tried to keep calm. He handed his cup to the guard, who emptied out the coffee, shook the cup to check, and that's when the padding Tim had put in came in handy. The guard handed the cup back, and Tim was able to return to his cell with the wooden key. As soon as Tim got back to his cell and the guards left the area, he immediately started trying to use the key. He inserted the key into the lock, excited, but quickly got disappointed when the key didn't work. It didn't open the lock. But Tim had expected this and was prepared for it. Choosing wood wasn't random. When the wooden key turned inside the lock left marks on the key, showing him where it was getting stuck. He had a small piece of metal, so he used it to carve out the key in the spots where the lock had marked it, trying to adjust the key to fit just right. Tim kept carving the key and inserting it into the lock, trying over and over, carving the key, inserting it again, and trying once more. He repeated this process until, finally, he succeeded and unlocked the lock. The wooden key worked. At that moment, Tim felt something indescribable, a feeling of triumph, of euphoria, like he had achieved something massive. But he knew this was just the beginning. The lock he unlocked was the lock for the first door of the cell, which was made of iron bars. But right behind this door was a second, fully armored iron door that sealed the cell, not just bars, but a complete door. And the worst part? That door didn't have a lock on the inside of the cell. It could only be opened from the outside. Tim knew this already, so he wasn't surprised to find this door in front of him. He knew there were two doors closing off the cell, and he knew that after opening the first one, the barred door, he'd face the problem of the second door, the one with no lock on the inside. But Tim was working with the mindset of solving the current problem first and then dealing with the next challenge later. There was a small window next to the door that a prisoner could reach their hand through, but it was impossible to get to the external lock from that distance. Either way, before Tim could even figure out how to reach the lock from inside the cell, he first had to make the right key for that lock. His only chance to take measurements of the outer lock was on Friday, the day they cleaned the section. Every Friday morning, the guards would take the prisoners out of their cells to clean the section and the hallway in front of the cells. And by the way, all the prisoners in that section were political prisoners, so they were cooperative. They knew about Tim and Stephen's plan, and they would cover for them and warn them if any guards were coming close. At first, Tim tried to use the same key he'd used for the inner door, but it didn't work. It wasn't the right fit. So, once again, he took measurements of the lock using the same method as with the first one, brought out paper and a pen, measured the depth, and sketched an approximate shape of the key. Then, he made the key in the workshop and smuggled it out the same way, using the coffee cup. Afterward, he tested the new key and adjusted it using the small metal piece, just like he had done with the first key. He kept trying and adjusting it until the key finally worked. Keep in mind, Tim was testing the key while the door was open, because they were cleaning the section and the hallway. When he tested the key, he locked the door, but it didn't open. When he tried turning the key again to unlock it, he realized the lock was stuck. A piece of metal in the lock was sticking out and hadn't gone in. The key would slide in and out of the lock easily, but it wouldn't turn. Tim tried again and again, but it was no use. Cleaning time was almost over, and the guards were about to return. Tim tried everything he could. He hit the lock with his hand, tried turning the key again, but nothing worked. The lock wouldn't budge. In the end, the guards came, so Tim left the lock and went back to his cell. Of course, the guards saw the lock, but instead of blaming the prisoners or thinking that one of them tampered with it or made a key for it, they started blaming each other. They thought one of them had left the lock in that condition. They didn't suspect the prisoners at all. They said it wasn't a big deal, opened the lock with their keys, closed the door, and locked it again. Tim, of course, took a deep breath because he was terrified they might search the cell and find his wooden keys, but luckily for him, things worked out in his favor this time. After that incident, Tim and Stephen decided that they wouldn't test the lock again with the door open. They would only test it when the door was closed. Now we come to the main problem, as I mentioned before. The lock for the outer door could only be opened from the outside, and the small window next to the door was too far for a prisoner to reach the lock with their hand. Tim and Stephen were stuck on this problem for a long time, just thinking of a solution. Finally, one day, inspiration hit Tim. They were allowed to keep cleaning brooms in their cells, so Tim came up with an inventive idea. He took a small wooden block, attached the key to it, and used a screw to fix the wooden block to the end of the broomstick. This way, Tim could extend the stick and rotate the wooden block, along with the key, inside the lock. A very clever invention. Trying something like this was risky because it could make noise, and the guards would occasionally do random inspections. Of course, his friend Stephen was on lookout duty, keeping his eyes and ears open for any sounds that might indicate a guard approaching the section. Tim extended his arm through the window while holding the broomstick, and he even tied a small rope around his hand so that if he dropped it, he could retrieve it easily. Tim reached out and tried to get the key into the lock. In his other hand, he held a small mirror to see where the keyhole was, because he couldn't stick his head out of the window due to the iron bars. He kept trying and trying to get the key into the lock, but the process was extremely difficult. Finally, after a long time, he managed to insert the key into the lock. He took a deep breath, feeling a bit relieved, and started to calm his nerves. Then he tried to turn the key in the lock, but unfortunately, the key didn't work. Tim pulled the broomstick back and started working on the key again using the small metal piece. The marks from the lock were clear on the key, so he knew exactly where to carve and where the key was getting stuck inside the lock. So he sat down and carved in those spots, trying to adjust the key's shape to fit the lock better. He kept at it for several nights, trying each night for as long as possible for several hours, adjusting the key. Imagine, this process took him 2 whole months. He had to remake the key several times because it was incredibly difficult. Still, he didn't give up and kept trying. Finally, one day, he opened the lock. After hundreds, maybe even thousands of attempts, the joy Tim felt at that moment was indescribable, probably the happiest he had ever been in his entire life. The funny thing is, when I was preparing this story, I was reading it and hoping Tim would succeed in opening the lock. I don't know why, but I felt the same excitement, even though I wasn't locked up. It was a huge victory for them. I mean, in the end, they were now able to get out of their cells, and they could easily open both doors. By the way, all the cells used the same lock, so it made sense that they didn't have a unique lock for each one. Now, the only door left was the section door. The only time they could test that door's lock was during the cleaning period we talked about, the time that happened every Friday morning. First, of course, before Tim tried to make a new key, he decided to test the keys they already had, just in case one of them worked. And here was the pleasant surprise. When he tried the first key he used to open the inner cell door, it opened the lock. They were using the same lock for the section door. And here, you can't even imagine the joy they felt. It saved them a ton of effort. Now, they could open their cell doors and the section door. At this point, Tim and Stephen sat down to talk. Their original plan was to escape through the prison yard, meaning they'd get out of their section and either dig a tunnel or somehow climb over the 6-meter-tall iron fence. But Tim said to Stephen, "Why don't we just leave through the door, the main door, the staff door, or any door that leads outside? If I can make keys for these doors, I can make keys for any other doors we come across." Stephen thought the idea was a little crazy because they didn't know how many doors they would face or where they'd even find the door that leads outside. They didn't know the prison's layout. So, to figure out the layout of the prison and the path they'd need to take after leaving their cells and section, Stephen came up with a plan. He pretended to have severe tooth pain. There wasn't a dentist in the prison, so they had to take him out to visit one. And when he was taken out of the prison and passed through all the doors, he learned the path they needed to take. When he got back to Tim, the news wasn't great. He told him that he passed through 7 doors after leaving the section, which meant the total number of doors they'd have to go through to get outside was 10. But at least now they had a clear idea of the path they needed to follow. At this stage, they felt like they needed another member on their team. During this time, Tim had formed a friendship with another prisoner who was in for a similar charge as theirs. This prisoner's name was Alex Mempers. When they offered him the chance to escape with them, he got excited immediately. He'd been wanting to join them, but didn't know how to start. Stephen explained the layout and the path full of doors they needed to open. And to give you a clearer picture, I've drawn this diagram for you that shows the path and the doors they needed to unlock. Here, we divide the cells. The first two doors they obviously had to open were the two on the cell itself, which we'll call door number 1 and door number 2. After leaving the cell, they'd face the section door, which is door number 3. Once they got past that, there would be a staircase leading them down since, as we mentioned, they were on the second floor. At the bottom of the stairs is door number 4. After passing through that door, there's a hallway, and at the end of it is door number 5. But before door number 5, there's a room, the main guard room, where the guard on duty for the section is usually stationed. After they passed door number 5, they reached door number 6, then door number 7, which was a set of bars, followed by door number 8, then door number 9. After door 9, there was a small staircase leading to door number 10, which was the door that would get them out of the prison. Keep in mind, this 10th door was a staff or guard door, used for entering the prison directly, kind of like a back door, different from the main gate. So, if they could reach this door and get out, they could escape the prison without having to cross the yard or deal with the fence. This way, they wouldn't have to face the dogs patrolling the yard at night or the armed guards on the rooftops. But the biggest challenge was that they had to get through all the doors in front of them. Just remember that this layout was simplified. The prison itself was more complicated, but this map helped them visualize the path they needed to take. Now, they had already passed the first 3 doors, and the next one facing them was door number 4, which they would reach after going down the stairs. The advantage they had with this door was that they saw it and passed through it daily, because it was the door that led them to the workshop, the yard, and other areas of the prison. Every day, they watched the guards unlock this door in front of them. So Tim focused on the shape and size of the key, trying to memorize it. The key wasn't that different from the previous ones, so he made a similar key to the ones he had crafted before. But now the problem was how to test it. The door wasn't close to them, and leaving their cells, exiting their section, and going down the stairs to get to that door was a big risk. So they had to minimize that risk by calculating it carefully and keeping an eye on the guards' movements. One piece of information they had discovered was that after 5 p.m., there was usually only one guard in charge of their section. And of course, the dogs were released in the yard, and the armed guards were on the rooftops. But as we said, they didn't need to go into the yard. They just had to be careful of the guard inside the section, who usually sat in the guard's office. There were different guards who rotated for the night shifts, but there was one guard who took this shift more often than the others because he liked working nights. Luckily for the prisoners, this guard had a strict routine he never changed. Every night he would play music through the prison's internal sound system and the speakers in the cells. He'd sit in his office, relaxing and listening to the music with the prisoners. After the music ended, he'd get up and leave the office to do his nightly round, checking the cells. During the time when the music was playing, the prisoners knew he was in his office, so they used this time to their advantage. They left their cells, and the ones who went out were Tim and Alex. After that, they passed through the section door, which was door number 3, went down the stairs, and reached door number 4 at the bottom. They started trying their new key, but as usual, the key didn't work on the first try. But Tim was ready, and he had a piece of metal with him, so he immediately started adjusting the key. Tim had become an expert at this stuff, and everything was easier this time. It definitely wasn't as hard as when he was reaching out with the broomstick, like he had to do with the cell door, which took him 2 whole months to crack. With door number 4, the first time they went down, Tim was able to adjust the key and unlock the door quickly. Afterward, they climbed the stairs again and returned to their section and cells. Just a few minutes later, the music stopped, and the night guard started his round, coming out of his room and heading toward the cells. Now, they could open 4 out of 10 doors, but with every bit of progress they made, the task became even more difficult. Because the doors were getting farther and farther from their cells, now they had to face door number 5, which was literally right in front of the guard's office. So, how could they get to this door and test their keys on it while the guards were in the room next door? Even if it was possible to get between door 4 and door 5, the risk was huge, and if they got caught, they'd get years added to their sentence. So they had to find a way to test the key on door 5 without the guards being in the office. The only time the guard wasn't in the office was during his rounds, when he'd leave the office, walk down the hallway, and then head up the stairs. But how could they leave their cells and get to door number 5 from the same path the guard was taking? That would have them meeting him halfway. The solution they came up with was to hide under the stairs. They noticed there was a small closet under the stairs, big enough for 2 or 3 people. Since they knew the guard played music, and after the music ended, he'd start his rounds. They could leave their cells when the music was playing, then wait until the guard left his office, passed through door number 4, and walked up the stairs toward their section. Then, they'd come out from under the stairs, from the closet they were hiding in, and go to door number 5 to test their keys. After they got together, talked through the plan, and practiced it a few times until they had it memorized, they decided to take the risk and go for it. This was the best plan they could think of. The first step was arranging the blankets to make it look like someone was sleeping under them because the guard would come to check the cells while they weren't there. So, they had to make him think they were under the blankets asleep so he wouldn't check too closely. As soon as the music started, it was their signal to move. First, Tim started by unlocking the outer door of his cell using the broomstick. He tried to fit the key into the outer lock, and as usual, it was tough and took several tries. But after a few attempts, he finally got the key in, unlocked the door, and stepped out of his cell. Then he went to Alex's cell and unlocked his door, and the two of them quickly exited the section, went down the stairs, and hid in the closet under the stairs. They were incredibly nervous. This was the first time they were out of their cells, and the guard was about to pass right in front of them. The problem was that once they got into the small closet, they faced an issue they hadn't thought of: closing the closet door from the inside. The handles were on the outside, and there was only a small latch on the inside, the size of a coin. Alex was holding the door with his shaking hand, gripping this tiny latch, and on top of that, he was nervous and sweating because the situation was so intense. The guard was coming their way, leaving his office and walking toward them. Both of them were terrified. The guard reached door number 4, and they heard him take out his key, unlock the door, and step through. At that moment, Alex, whose hand was trembling, accidentally let go of the small latch because of his nerves and the sweat dripping off him. Imagine being in their place and the intense anxiety they must have felt. This was the worst thing that could have happened to them. The closet door was open, and the guard was coming right toward them, making them think it was over and they'd been caught. But as usual, luck was on their side. The guard didn't notice them or the open closet door in front of him. His eyes were on the stairs, and he kept walking, going right up without even glancing at the closet or its door. Even though they were still shaken up, Tim and Alex knew they had no time to waste and had to move immediately. As soon as they heard the guard enter the cell section above, they came out of the closet and headed toward door number 4. Luckily for them, the guard hadn't locked the door behind him, so they didn't even need to use the key they'd made. It seemed to be a habit of the guard to leave doors unlocked behind him, since he was heading toward the cells and didn't expect any prisoners to be behind him. The two of them passed through door number 4 and headed straight down the hallway to door number 5. When they got there, the first thing Tim did was try the previous keys he had, and luckily, the key for door number 4 also worked on door number 5, allowing them to pass through it. But next, they were faced with door number 6, which looked entirely different and was clearly stronger. Tim immediately started working on the lock, while Alex kept watch through the crack in door number 5 in case the guard returned. At that moment, the guard was doing his rounds, passing by each cell and looking through the windows. When he looked into Tim's and Alex's cells, he'd see the blankets arranged to look like someone was sleeping under them. Stephen, who was still in his cell, was nervous, watching the guard and knowing that his friends were outside. He knew the guard took about 15 minutes to complete his rounds, so they had given themselves a 10-minute window before they had to get back quickly. Meanwhile, Tim was working on opening door number 6. First, he tried the keys he had, but none of them opened the lock, so he continued trying with other metal tools, but every attempt failed. The thing that made it hard, of course, was that he was super stressed, and his hands were literally shaking. When the 10 minutes they had given themselves were up, Alex said they had to go back now. But Tim kept trying and told him, "Just wait a little more. Just wait." It got to the point where Alex literally grabbed him and pulled him. They hurried back from the hallway to the stairs and hid again in the small closet. It was just moments before they heard the sound of the guard coming down the stairs, meaning if they delayed even a bit longer, the guard might have caught them, or at least run into them on the way back. Finally, they were able to breathe a sigh of relief after they saw the guard pass through door number 4 and head down the hallway toward his office. Then, they slipped out of the closet, went up the stairs to the second floor, entered the section, and returned to their cells. Tim felt defeated, as they only managed to get through one door, door number 5. But he had wanted to get through more doors that night. The whole trip was risky, and the more trips they made, the higher the chance they'd get caught. Imagine how the stress and pressure he felt that night made him unable to sleep. He was worried about the lock on door number 6, feeling it was one of the toughest locks in the whole prison, and knowing he'd have a really hard time with it. As for Alex, he didn't want to go back down again and attempt door 6, even though he was sure Tim would manage to unlock it. But he wasn't willing to risk going down multiple times for the trial and error. So Tim had to come up with a quick solution. During this time, Tim wasn't just making keys for the doors in their path, he was also making keys for other random doors in the prison. One of those was for a side door that was almost hidden, which could lead them to the workshop, and he even made a key for the workshop door itself. The workshop actually had several doors from different sides, so he made keys that would give them access, allowing them to sneak in and grab any tools they needed at any time. So now, Tim had a whole set of keys that was almost like a prison guard's key ring. But of course, his biggest concern was still the lock on door number 6, and he was thinking of a new way to make a special key for this door with a very high success rate. He came up with an idea and an innovative design. He made a key out of metal wires, but the head was wooden. That means the handle of the key was made of wires, and you might wonder how that works. This design allowed him to make several wooden heads that he could swap out quickly. The second advantage was that he could move the key around inside the lock more easily, because the wires could go deeper into the lock, letting him move the key head up and down and at different angles, something he couldn't do with normal wooden keys. This gave him more flexibility and meant that the wooden handle of the key didn't have to be 100% precise for the lock. When Tim finished this design, he felt like he had finally created the tool that would let him open door number 6 without any problems. And he didn't just want to open door number 6, he wanted to get through all the doors in one trip and in one night. But that was definitely going to take more time, so their friend Stephen, who would stay behind in his cell, had to find a way to distract the guard and make his round last longer. The night of the plan came. As soon as the prisoners heard the music start playing, they got moving. Tim got out of his cell and helped Alex out as well, and together they went down the stairs and reached the closet under the stairs, where they hid. They waited there until the music stopped, then they heard the guard and saw him pass by, heading up toward the cells. Immediately, they passed through door number 4, went down the hallway, and headed for door number 5. They unlocked door number 5 using the key for door 4, and now it was time for door number 6. Meanwhile, back at the cells, Stephen started his part of the plan to distract the guard. The plan was simple. Stephen knew the guard loved rugby, one of the most popular sports in South Africa. So he started talking to him about the game, who won, who lost, and how the matches went. The guard kept the conversation going because he really liked the game. Meanwhile, Tim was trying to unlock the 6th door using a wire key. He had 3 wooden heads that he was testing out with the lock, and as we mentioned earlier, he could move the key more freely inside the lock because the wires gave him better angles and more range of motion. He kept turning the key right and left, up and down, trying all possible ways to open the lock until he finally heard the sound of the lock opening. At that moment, Tim got excited again, and immediately he and Alex passed through the 6th door and found the 7th door in front of them. The 7th door was made of iron bars, and the lock was on the door. As soon as Tim saw it, he knew he could take the lock apart because the screws were visible on the outside. Among the tools Tim had was a small knife they used to cut bread, and the prison allowed them to keep it in their cells. Tim used this knife to unscrew the lock, and soon the lock was dismantled. He then tampered with the lock from the inside in a way that made it easier to open with the simplest move and put the lock back in place. This meant that the lock on the 7th door could now be easily opened with a wire or a piece of metal. After that, they crossed the 7th door and immediately headed to the next door, which, luckily for them, was simply open. Then they reached door number 9, and its lock was similar to the previous ones. Right away, Tim started trying the keys he had and discovered that door number 9 opened with the same key that unlocked door 4 and door 5. Meanwhile, at the cells, Stephen was still trying to keep the guard busy with the conversation. Even after the rugby game talk was over, he started talking to him about his life and family. But of course, Stephen couldn't keep the guard distracted much longer, so his friends had to finish their task quickly and return. Tim and Alex got to the 10th door, but they knew time was up and they had to turn back. The 10th door was a regular wooden door like the ones in the prison, and it was supposed to lead them directly outside. As I mentioned before, this door led them straight outside, not into a courtyard or another area inside the prison. The lock on the door was different from the rest, and they didn't have time to try it, so they decided to leave it and head back. They quickly moved toward the stairs and hid in the closet under the stairs, waiting for the guard to come down. Sure enough, it was only a minute or two before the guard came down. Then they quickly slipped out of the closet, went up the stairs, and returned to their cells. That night was a big success. They managed to get through all the doors except the last one. The next day, the 3 of them met in the prison yard as usual to discuss their next move. They felt like it was time to escape. Sure, they hadn't opened the 10th door yet, but with the experience they had gained, they felt confident they could find a way to unlock it. But this time, Stephen would be with them and wouldn't stay back in his cell to distract the guard. They needed to keep the guard busy for as long as possible this time because they knew this was the night they were really going to escape. As I told you before, the section they were in housed political prisoners, and they all shared the same ideas and supported each other. Their fellow inmates were ready to help them in their plan, even though they weren't escaping with them. Keep in mind, this kind of thing is almost impossible in a regular prison. Other inmates, if they didn't share the same views or weren't charged with the same crimes and against the government, wouldn't be likely to cooperate with them. The person they considered the leader of the political prisoners in the prison was named Denny Goldberg. Denny told them he would help and try to distract the guard. The idea they came up with was to cut the power to the section. The electrical switch was located on the staircase they used to leave the section. If they cut the power, Denise could call the guard and ask him to fix it, keeping him distracted. Finally, the big day came on December 11th, 1979. The three of them were super excited, but also incredibly tense. They tried to calm their nerves and focus on the mission. The first step was to change their clothes, so they put on civilian clothes they had stolen from one of the buildings in the prison. As I mentioned, Tim had made keys for different doors in the prison, besides the 10 doors on their path, so they were able to steal some tools and civilian clothes. These civilian clothes were an important part of the plan, because if they escaped in their prison uniforms, the guards or even people outside the prison could easily recognize them. They put on their civilian clothes and waited for the guard to turn on the music as usual. As soon as the music started, Tim moved and unlocked his cell door, then unlocked the inner door and the outer door with the broom key. After that, he immediately let his friends Stephen and Alex out of their cells. Dennis was watching them from his cell window and assured them he would call the guard as soon as they cut the power. The three of them exited the section. As I mentioned, the electrical switch for the section was on the stairwell. While they were going down, Alex opened the box and started messing with the wires inside, damaging them in a way that would make it hard to fix quickly, so the guard would be delayed. After that, the three of them immediately went down to the small closet under the stairs. This was the first time the three of them hid together inside the closet. The closet was small and barely fit them. Upstairs in the cells, Dennis started calling the guard at the top of his lungs, shouting that the electricity and lights had gone out. Moments later, the three hiding in the closet heard the guard's footsteps as he walked through the hallway. He was walking slowly, taking his time, while they were at peak anxiety, scared that the closet doors would slip out of their hands and open, like what happened last time. But then, the guard passed through the fourth door, went upstairs, and entered the cell block without seeing them. Immediately, the three of them got out of the closet, went through the fourth door into the hallway, and headed for the fifth door. The guard reached the cell block and was surprised that the lights were off and the power was out. So he went to Denny, who was calling for him, and told him that the power had suddenly gone out. But instead of checking the issue right away, he started chatting with him to waste time. Meanwhile, Stephen and Alex reached the fifth door and got through it easily, using the same key as for the fourth door. After that, they were faced with the sixth door, which had the toughest lock. But they had prepared the wire key and managed to get past it in 2 or 3 minutes after a few tries. Then they reached the seventh door, which was made of bars, and the lock had already been dismantled, making it easy to open with any tool. They passed the seventh door, then the eighth door was open as usual, and the ninth door they opened with the same key as for doors 4 and 5. Then they reached the small staircase leading to the 10th door. They went up the stairs, and Tom began trying the keys he had on the lock, but none of the keys worked. He kept trying one key after another, and the more he tried, the more anxious he got. This was the worst nightmare they could face at this moment, not being able to open the lock on the 10th door. Tim, after all the keys he had made and the locks he had opened, felt like a pro at picking locks, so he couldn't believe this final lock was stumping him. At this time, the guard finished talking with Denis and started moving toward the stairs to check what was wrong with the electrical switch. When he got to the switch, he began trying to fix the problem and rewire the cables. The 3 prisoners were still trying to open the door. They kept trying for more than 20 minutes, with Tim using every tool he had, but to no avail. After all that time, the guard managed to restore the power and finished his inspection round, then began heading back to his office. The three of them were still at the door when they heard the guard's footsteps as he returned and heard him open the office door and go inside, meaning the guard was now between them and the cells. If they thought about going back, they'd have to pass by the office. Tim's suggestion was to return to the cells and try again, despite the risk that if they went back, they'd have to pass in front of the office with the guard inside. He thought it was the best option, but Stephen and Alex disagreed and were set on the idea that they had to escape the prison now, with no turning back. So Alex grabbed one of the tools they had and decided to try and break the lock. This tool was one of the things they had stolen from the workshop after they made a key for it. Tim immediately objected, saying that trying to break the lock would make a lot of noise and the guard would likely hear them. But Alex had made up his mind, so he took the tool and started chiseling into the wood around the lock. By the way, the door was wooden. It wasn't armored or metal. The only armored door was door number 6. Alex's banging and chiseling on the wooden door was really loud and annoying. Tim was watching the hallway, terrified that the guard might come out of his office at any moment. Alex kept chiseling and hacking at the wood of the door until suddenly the door opened in front of them. It seemed the guard didn't hear them because he didn't come out of his office. Their joy at that moment was indescribable, but they knew they had to keep their emotions in check and not let the excitement take over, because they were still inside the prison grounds. They quietly opened the door and walked out calmly, but with their heads down, trying not to draw attention to themselves. At the same time, they were trying not to raise any suspicions. But a short distance after they exited the door, they saw a car parked nearby with 2 prison guards standing by it. It seemed like they had just finished their shift and were getting ready to head home. At that moment, their hearts were pounding, but they kept their cool and kept walking. The 2 guards didn't pay much attention. They glanced at them once or twice, then went back to talking to each other. After all, the 3 of them were dressed in civilian clothes, and it wouldn't make sense for prisoners to be in that area. After a bit more walking, they got farther away from the prison and reached one of the city's main streets. At that moment, they finally felt like they could breathe easy and really started to feel the joy and triumph, knowing their escape plan had worked. Usually, this is the point in prison escape stories where we get to the sad part, where the prisoners get caught after escaping. But this time, I can assure you that this story is different. Maybe for the first time in the history of this channel, we're telling a prison escape story where the prisoners didn't get caught afterward. What happened was that these 3 had arranged with a man from Zimbabwe, a neighboring country to South Africa, and this man was a smuggler. They made a deal with him to smuggle them to Zimbabwe. And sure enough, they escaped with him from South Africa and made it to Zimbabwe. From there, they left Zimbabwe and went to Zambia, then to Tanzania. And from Tanzania, they were able to fly to London. They stayed there until apartheid ended in South Africa in 1994. I honestly don't know if they ever returned to South Africa or stayed in London or went somewhere else. I'm not sure. But Tim Jenkin later wrote a book called Escape from Pretoria, where he tells the full story and how they pulled off the escape in detail. That book was later turned into a dramatic movie, and Tim went on to make several documentaries and give lectures and talks around the world about their amazing escape. And that's where the story ends. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. And if you've got time, go ahead and watch this episode. I'm sure you'll love it. I guarantee you. See you later. I'll catch you in the next video. Bye.